David Penn, Research Analyst with Finovate. Thank you for joining us for the Finovate FinTech Halftime Review. Coming up, our presentation and conversation with Marc Gaffan. He is the CEO of Hysolate. We're going to be talking about the new normal of working in finance. Now, before we begin, please know that this is an interactive presentation, and we welcome your questions and comments. Please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to take up your questions and comments toward the end of the session. With that, we've got quite a bit to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Marc, take it away.
All right, David, thank you very much and welcome everyone. I do want to reiterate what David just mentioned about providing questions. I would definitely like this to be more of an interactive session than just me providing a monologue here. But we are here to talk about in the next few minutes about what the new normal of working in finance looks like. And the focus of this presentation is really to talk about some of the changes that we're seeing in the industry as a result of the pandemic. And if we go back, if we rewind 15 or 16 months when COVID broke, most of us thought that the sky was falling. And I would say that, put our personal lives aside for just a moment, on our professional side, the IT and security guys definitely had or one of the worst tasks at hand, making sure that organizations could work remotely, continue to be productive. We obviously spoke to lots and lots and lots of prospects and customers and leaders in the industry to try and understand what they were doing, how they were addressing all these challenges. And 3 months into the pandemic, after everyone was, to some extent had done some triage of their IT systems, made sure that the levels of productivity were as good as they could get them in that short term, we polled different IT and security leaders to understand how the pandemic changed their thinking about this whole concept of working from home and how does the corporate IT environment will look like in the future. And this was over a year ago, and 86% of CISOs told us that at that stage they thought that working from home or working remotely or working from anywhere was going to be something that would stay long term. Almost two-thirds, 60%, adjusted their endpoint security policies to cater for the fact that now, if their previous design models were 90% of their employees would spend 90% of their time in the office behind the corporate firewall, now, I don't know if it's 90 or 95 or close to 100% of their employees are spending 100% of their time outside the firewall on home networks, trying to do their jobs, and 60% of them told us that they adjusted some of their policies, and almost the same number actually relaxed some of their security postures to enable productivity. Obviously, productivity was top of mind back then. And what we also learned is that not only did they relax some of their security measures, but even broader regulatory requirements. They actually had open dialogues with some of the regulators to make sure that they could ease and do some things that they typically wouldn't do in the past because of the situation. Obviously, trying to have the right controls in place. But obviously, that was, we were going through a big crisis back then. We still are to some extent. And those desperate times require desperate measures. Another thing that was quite interesting is after 3 months of people working from home, it became pretty noticeable that what worked for us in the office didn't always work for us at home. At that point, when we surveyed the CISOs, 50% of them told us that they believed that less security restrictions would improve the workforce productivity. They're already starting to see some of the pain increasing. 62% of the companies told us that they prevent free web browsing, so there's lots of restrictions applied to web browsing. 77% told us that they prevent installing third-party applications. And one of the more acute situations were essentially with employees that required admin rights on their device, and obviously they needed those privileges to do their jobs, but that's the typical CISO nightmare of having people out there, especially when they're in their home environments, with admin rights on those endpoints that are connected through VPNs and are essentially on their network. And that was quite a headache that CISOs had to deal with back then and still have to deal with today. The other challenge is that not everyone had a laptop. So not everyone could take their laptop from their office and go home and work in the home environment. And that was, specifically a challenge. How do you use the infrastructure that's already in place with your employees? This could be their personal devices. How do you try and incorporate them into your IT footprint, obviously with the ability to have the right controls in place, the right security in place? And one of the things that people told us, yes, we are allowing our employees to connect from a personal device through a VPN, so a secure channel into our organization. Obviously, there are lots of challenges with that. And one of the biggest challenges that we heard constantly from different IT and security teams was the concern about split tunneling. 70% of the CISOs told us that's one of the top things that's keeping them up at night. In terms of...
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question with regard to that split tunneling in particular. Given the way that you set that up, it seems like that is a particularly thorny area. I'm curious some of the challenges as they relate to that process of split tunneling and how those challenges were induced by the sort of the work from home reality, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, David. The challenge around split tunneling that we heard from customers and from prospects that we spoke to is that the essence of split tunneling, or the prerequisite for a split tunnel, is the fact that we use what's known as an always-on VPN to connect into our corporate environment. That means that when we turn on that VPN, the entire networking of that device is essentially now connecting through the corporate environment. So if I'm sitting in my house in New Jersey and my corporate's in New York City, everything I'm doing on the internet runs through that corporate environment, whether I'm accessing corporate data, which is fine, that's the way it should be. But if I'm getting on a Zoom call, if I'm downloading content, or if I'm just browsing the web, all that is flowing through my corporate environment, which means that my capacity on my VPN systems, these could be my VPN gateways, the transit into my organization, are being overloaded. Now, they're overloaded by multiple things. They're overloaded with the fact that all of a sudden, 100% of my workforce is remote, and I've provisioned upfront for maybe 10 or 15, maybe 20% of my workforce to be remote. So they are all remote now. So the typical load on my systems is super high. Not only are they working remotely, but they're doing video conferencing remotely, which is super, super high in terms of the bandwidth and the resource consumption on our VPN gateways. And what organizations would typically try and do is introduce what's known as split tunneling. Split tunneling means that I can take some traffic through my corporate environment and some of the traffic goes directly to the open internet. And you would want that because you want anything that I need to access in the corporation, systems, documents, files, servers, etc., should go in that secure way on the VPN. But anything that I'm doing, like a Zoom meeting or a video conference, or accessing, just browsing the web for something that I need to do at work, I don't want that running through my corporate environment because there's no good use in that. The challenge for that is that by opening up the endpoint, the laptop, essentially, to being connected at the same time to the internet and connected to my corporate environment, I'm bridging my corporate environment with the open internet. Meaning, if I download a piece of malware, for example, onto my endpoint, it's downloaded onto a device that's connected to my corporate network, potentially bringing in all those bad things into my corporate environment. And the challenge is, how do you get that capacity alleviation, essentially, without introducing additional risks into your corporate network? David, I hope that was clear.
That was perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Cool. So when we asked the different companies, what are you using to enable your employees or contractors to connect to your corporate networks and applications, we got a mixed set of answers. VPN and VDI, desktop as a service, were the two leading ones. Of course, some of them, some of the respondents, 22%, didn't allow whatsoever connectivity whatsoever from a non-corporate device. What's interesting is that zero trust, while still there's lots of buzz around zero trust these days, it's still fairly in its infancy from an adoption perspective. And what we also found is that some of these technologies were used, of course, in conjunction. So VPN with MFA and lots of VPN usage with a VDI type of solution. So really a mixed use of different technologies to enable non-corporate devices to connect into the enterprise.
It was interesting to note there on that, and the graph you had there, that the DVI DAS really fairly clearly stood out in terms of the choice. Are enterprises comfortable with that fact?
So that's a fair point. I think that what we've seen is that enterprises were typically very comfortable providing VDI access and desktop as a service access from corporate devices. When it came to accessing, allowing that from non-corporate devices, personal devices, they were more reluctant. One of the things that they would typically do in conjunction is deploy VPN, but it definitely is a challenge, or at least from what we're hearing, to allow VDI access from I'm going to call it a rogue device, because assuming that it's a personal device, we all need to assume as security practitioners that it's a rogue device. Having something connecting to our corporate environment that can see corporate data, can actually transact. Although the payload in a VDI or a desktop as a service environment is running in the cloud, the remote control to that workload essentially is on that user's device. So while the system itself is not running, the remote control, the VDI client, is running on that user's device. And session takeovers and attacks that capture credentials and can capture screenshots are something that's very, very concerning, with a top of mind challenge today that a lot of the people that we are talking to are trying to deal with and trying to figure out how they can encapsulate access to VDI and DAS systems on non-corporate devices.
Interesting, thanks. So
what was interesting for us to do is a year later, and what we actually did is we repolled a lot of the same people and a broader audience about a month ago to try and understand what's changed. A year into that pandemic, we've done a lot of adjustments. We're rethinking some of our strategies. I think we're all coming to terms with the fact that remote work is a phenomenon that's, we probably leaped 10 years ahead in a natural situation in terms of how many people will be working remotely. I think that any security and IT team today in their business continuity plan will have the pandemic section in the BCP. And what was interesting for us is to see, what's changed in the thinking across different security groups. What we're seeing is that this whole, call it employee friction, or the restrictions that are imposed on employees, has become a lot more severe and higher in terms of mind share with IT and security groups. 93% told us that their employees are working around some of the IT restrictions. 7% only are kind of happy with what they're doing. And when we asked them to grade or rank the severity, or how common or how often those workarounds were taking place, a third said very, very often. So in most cases, people are working around them. 44%, to some extent. 26 said rarely, but that's definitely something that is, that is concerning. And it's obvious that people need to get their jobs done, and people will try and do anything that they can in order to get their jobs done. They are not, they may be educated about security concerns, but if it's a question of, can I do my job, or if I need to run through a million hoops in order to do it, what are the chances that my device is hacked? Okay, that's a typical, or why should it happen to me? But that's exactly what happens. Another thing that was really interesting is you wanted to get the different perspectives between the IT teams and the security teams, and to see their view on that. And what you can see on the lower chart, essentially, that the perspective on, for the security teams was a lot more severe. So they definitely see things a more worst case scenario. They see that more people are breaking the rules more often. Obviously, it's their job to make sure that those rules are are maintained. So the IT people think that the situation is a little bit better. The security people think that the situation is quite more severe. That's just an interesting perspective on the different stakeholders within an organization. What we also learned by asking these audiences were a couple of questions about, for example, are they looking to increase more IT freedom from the users, going in or connecting from anywhere? And more than 87% said absolutely, we want to give them more freedom. But when we asked them, do you want to impose more restrictions on your employees? 80% or 79% told us, yes, we actually want to impose more restrictions. It's to some extent our desire to eat our cake and have it too, which is obviously something that we have to find a happy medium between the two. But it's very, very apparent that on the one hand, we need to maintain our security controls. On the other hand, we realize that we need to provide more freedom and a capability to enable our employees to be more productive. And the third completing question that we asked in this section in the survey is, what's your sentiment towards third-party access? And 87%, or almost 1 out of 9, said to us that's absolutely a major concern. We believe, and what we're seeing in general, is that the usage of contractors and non-corporate devices that essentially are required today to get incorporated or take part in the corporate IT game has increased significantly, and therefore the headache has become so severe.
It's really interesting looking at those three categories. You really see the challenge for IT and security in this. And I'm curious, I guess your previous slide sort of gave us a sense of why there was a need to increase this freedom, because if you don't increase it, users will take it upon themselves to free themselves, apparently. And I'm just curious how you would explain the negotiation of that balance between the almost 90 that say more freedom and almost an equal amount that say more restrictions at the same time.
Yeah, so I think that the work from home or work remotely environment has pushed some of the pains that existed a year ago to become a lot more acute and severe today. The needs have changed. Some of the software requirements and the IT requirements that we have today are different, and I'll explain specifically what I mean. The usage of collaboration tools. These could be video conferencing. These could be data sharing. These could be, the instant messaging type of tools that we need have become the bread and butter of how we communicate, how we collaborate with people in a remote environment. So we need those to be productive. On the flip side, those tools are typically the IT and security team's nightmare, because they are essentially a channel in and a channel out of their IT, into their IT organization or into the IT fabric of the company. You can share files, which means that you can exfiltrate data. You can share files. That means that you can essentially contain or contract malware. Those tools are often, the higher level of collaboration that they provide, the higher the risk that they pertain to the organization. So it's something that's become a lot more acute in the need, but also in the risks that are the risks that have been introduced, and that's why organizations are looking for solutions to solve them.
Excellent.
We wanted to drill down further with some of those questions, and also not just ask if they were breaking the rules, but essentially what were they doing, or what were the granular activities that those employees were doing when they broke some of those rules. And the most common requirement, or what people were doing, were installing what's known as unsanctioned applications, the need to install unsanctioned applications. And some of these applications are some of those applications, David, that I mentioned earlier, in the sense that, collaboration, communication, they need to, install things to get their jobs done. But what was also very, very clear is that people are using their corporate device for non-corporate activities as well. And these are, they're not being malicious or they're not doing any damage, but 17% told us that they need to use their endpoint for personal activities as well. And, lots of organizations would typically say, you know what, it's a corporate device. We actually don't want and don't allow you doing personal stuff. But on the other hand, people have taken their corporate device into their homes. Often they are sitting on their desks in their home offices. They're taking up space. They've connected their personal monitor to it. They need to use the internet. They need to do things. And yes, they can do it on their personal device, but they've to some extent disabled their personal home device because they've got their laptop in place, or they've got their laptop on the kitchen table because that's the only place they can work at home, and that's now readily available. And we've all had our families around us during these difficult times. And what if one of our kids needs to check their grades online? These are all things that are temptations and are conveniences that employees want. And we're definitely seeing an increase in that use case as well. The other very prominent use case that we saw was specifically with a cohort of developers, and these are IT and development cohorts within organizations that require these type of capabilities. In corporate environments, often there are servers that exist within the office. Not everything is in the cloud and can be accessed remotely. A lot of them require some type of additional environment in order to do testing in a way that's not going to that's not going to impose any security threats. Those were the typical things that we saw from customers when we polled them. And another thing that was interesting was about around website blocking. So people need to use the internet more freely in order to do their jobs. These could be knowledge workers that need to do research, they need to go online. Some of the restrictions imposed on them, are very, very prohibitive in terms of their ability to do their jobs. The other thing that we looked at specifically is, with regards to installing unsanctioned applications, is there a variance between different industries, between different segments, to try and identify areas where there was higher pain? What we saw specifically, and to the audience that's on this session, is that financial services was actually more on the conservative side, which was quite interesting for us.
It's interesting looking at all of those categories there. One thing that kind of sticks out to me is that you have maybe retail on the high end, which maybe isn't as surprising given the way people tend to think of retail and retail employment. Energy and utilities and insurance being relatively high, almost more than twice as high as financial services, really jumps off the page to me.
Yeah, so that's an interesting observation. We actually, racked our heads around some of the theories that we could think of why this is, and I think it really depends on two things. A, it depends on how locked down these industries or the endpoints in these industries are typically. Okay, so in an energy and a utilities environment, you'll see a super, super high level of lockdown because of the criticality of some of these devices. Same goes for industrial and manufacturing. You can see that they're on the two ends of the spectrum almost. Right. Our theory around that is either the devices are so locked down that people don't even think about the option. They are completely thinking in the other direction, in the sense that they wouldn't even imagine installing a third party, or they don't even have that desire to do that. So it's really a balance between the initial state of how locked down the device is, and the type of work that they need to do, that employees need to do. Obviously, people in an insurance company or people in a retail environment may need to go. Some of the retail companies went online. There was a massive increase in e-commerce. A lot of the staff needed to have this more IT freedom and be able to do some of the things that they didn't need to do in the past. These are some of the theories that we could come up with on why specifically these different industries behaved in this way.
Yeah, interesting.
So what we did also ask the people that we spoke to is about the future and about what are they doing or how are they planning to address some of these challenges. Mm-hmm. And what we saw is that the technologies that are mostly in use today are the EPM, the endpoint privilege management software or capabilities that are already in place. Application isolation is also high up there. And of course, browser isolation, desktop as a service, and VDI at the bottom are what they're using today. And in terms of their priorities moving forward, browser isolation was definitely the highest up there in terms of what they plan to use. So is desktop as a service, while the other technologies are planned but are pretty constant in terms of the demand around it. So we thought that was also super interesting to try and poll different organizations across multiple verticals on what they planned to do as a result of some of their learnings and their future plans due to the pandemic and this whole new working environment. Mm-hmm. So that's essentially what the survey yield, and this is how we're viewing the priorities of organizations today. David, I haven't been monitoring the chat, and I don't know if we've had any questions come in, but I think that this is a time for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, let's do that. I do want to point out one thing that you talked about earlier at looking at this final slide, and that idea that the companies are looking at a fairly broad approach that are seeming to show a willingness to try a variety of techniques to address the problem. And certainly when you look at the comparison between what people are already using and what their plans to use are, you see a little bit of a differentiation what they're already using fairly significantly. But in terms of going forward, it appears to me at least that you really do see an embrace of almost all of the various technologies fairly equally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are the leading technologies. I would say that aside from VDI, which is on the decline, and DASC or desktop as a service is to some extent a newer evolution of virtual desktop or VDI infrastructure. All the other categories are leading categories today, are part of the different strategies or the corporate building blocks that different organizations are using to address different types of use cases. So they have different types of different people in their workforce with different requirements, with different IT capabilities, and they need to address all of these, and therefore they need a variety of technologies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And definitely that point you made about the VDI is underscored. If you look all the way to the far right under no plans, that one does show the least interest maybe going forward compared to the others fairly significantly. So I think it underscores the point that you made about VDI being maybe on the way out in favor of some of the other options. Yeah.
As I said, VDI is definitely being replaced by desktop as a service and some other technologies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, again, I want to remind our audience that we are taking your questions and comments, by that matter. If you have a comment about your own experience in terms of working in finance, how your organization or bank has been addressing some of these issues. Virtually all of us are, so it would be very interesting if you don't have a question and just have an insight that you've experienced, and maybe if you have something that's at variance with some of the findings and conclusions that we'd be able to reach here, that would also be something interesting for you to share with. So feel free to go ahead and include that in the comments as well as any questions that you might have. I'm going to take a quick look at some of the questions that we've got here. One of the questions sort of has to do with employees' devices, and it's an interesting way of looking at it. The possibility of employers giving their workers more than one device as one way of addressing the security and freedom concern. Is that something that's being considered?
It is, and we see different industries essentially having different appetites towards giving employees more than one device. The challenge that we have today is we use our device for multiple capabilities. Some of them are high risk activities, some of them are lower risk activities, and creating one single security posture in a single monolithic operating system is a challenge. We know of very, very large enterprises that some of their developers have multiple laptops. They use one of their laptops to access a production website. The industry term for that is a privileged access workstation, and the only thing they do from that device is access some of the privileged or more sensitive resources in the enterprise. However, we also hear from a lot of the employees that it's a pain. They don't want to be carrying multiple laptops in their backpack. They don't have space on their desks for multiple devices. So they definitely are requirements to try and find better solutions than having multiple devices.
Yeah, I can certainly see it. It reminds me of the split tunneling aspect in some respects, that it definitely solves one issue, but it definitely opens up other potential problems as well, including just the simple the usability. I mean, as you pointed out, with regard to users getting around some of the security issues, folks can be very creative when it comes to trying to get their work done. And I can just imagine that potentially with two devices, some of the both on the ends of the creative things that could be done with those, and even potentially that frustration level skyrocketing if you have some sort of issue and you've got two devices that you've got to be dealt with as opposed to just a single one.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely.
I also want to take another look at the difference between the security and the IT perspective, which I thought was a little bit interesting that you pointed out earlier ago. Is that, what do you attribute that difference in perspective in terms of the various threats between IT on the one hand and the security on the other? It seems, I think, maybe commonsensical that they would have a fairly similar sense of the threat, but I did find it interesting that they do see it a little bit differently. And I'm curious, then, as we look towards solutions, does that difference between the way that they see some of these threats matter in terms of figuring out some of the better ways of solving some of these problems?
Yeah, so, I don't think that there's differences in the threats. I think that it's a matter of perspective. I think that the security guys by nature their job is to protect. The IT guys obviously are, need to take that into consideration, but they need to make sure that people actually do their work. So I would say it's two different panes of glass for the to the same phenomena. One team just sees things a lot more harshly than the other, which I actually found quite natural. But it is surprising to see that the differences of opinion are statistically sound. There is definitely a difference of opinion there. Even if they are the same company, the same industry, there's definitely a different perspective there on employee behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in the minds of some folks, and maybe it's also an issue of the size of the institution, how the institution is constructed, the IT security team gets either conflated or is a singular entity in some instances. So that was one of the reasons why I found that kind of an interesting, like you said, maybe more of an interesting perspective than necessarily position, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I wanted to just sort of touch on, which had to do with the idea of productivity, and in terms of how that relates to both security and IT stakeholders in an organization. I'm curious, we talked a lot about how some of the issues of security were sort of set to the side during this stretch in order to get work done and keep that productivity high. I'm curious, as we're starting to emerge from at least the most intense period of some of this, does that shift back? I mean, how do we, in terms of looking at that new normal, how does that shift of, okay, we're going to allow a certain measure of, for lack of a better phrase, corner cutting to ensure productivity, as things ease back in the same way of people going back to the office and so forth? How does that balance between, if you want to call it freedom or security, does that become recalibrated now that we're in a different situation?
Yeah, that's, I think that's definitely something to consider. I would look at the security/productivity almost as a pendulum. That's kind of weighing in different, at different times it's leaning in different, different directions. What we saw when the pandemic broke is that this question of productivity became a board level discussion. Obviously, security has become a board level discussion in the recent years. But this question of productivity, the first thing that I as a CEO was asked by my board is, hey, how productive is the team? Is the team able to do their work? What's the level of productivity? We were all trying to keep productivity high, and therefore, and that's because of the fact that we changed the way we were operating as an organization. We had everyone remote all of a sudden. It's something that's completely different. From a management perspective, from a control perspective, from a visibility perspective, are people working at home, or are they dealing with other things? How do you get a grips of all this? And so productivity became a massively emphasized topic, and therefore I think it because of its importance, it drove a higher agenda essentially, and therefore we were willing to compromise to some extent. Of course, to some extent, not in a way that would be reckless, on some of the security measures that we had in place, in order to enable that productivity. Because at the end of the day, business continuity was top of mind, and keeping that level, but keeping those levels of productivity was very important. Mm-hmm. David, we also saw it with, I think I mentioned this earlier. We had, customers that were literally were talking to their regulators on an ongoing basis. How do we enable remote signatures? Up until now, we did everything paper. We did this specific task. People had to come into the branch or have to come into the office and sign the physical paper. That just cannot happen anymore. And do you just stop work, or do you enable electronic signing remotely? So lots of types of, not just necessarily on the security side, but also the compliance, the way we did things. I think that a lot of the people that we spoke to actually view this as a clutter buster, or a way to leapfrog the regulation to some extent, to be a lot more remote friendly, cloud friendly. Typically regulation is the last to move. We all have, our concerns about, are we being held back by the regulators? And this, to some extent, compelled us to adjust. It compelled, the regulators to adjust to a reality where we now understand that we can do things remotely. We maybe relaxed some of the controls, but we're now building compensating measures in place, or we are readjusting back, or recalibrating, as you said, back to a situation where we can keep this flexible work posture, but also maintain the highest level of security controls that we can have in place. And I think one of the top things in mind today for the security and the IT guys is around flexibility, being able to address new situations very quickly. So how do you think about creating an agile IT and security posture, not necessarily the most secure, but how do you adapt to new situations? Because we also saw that when the pandemic broke, we saw the attackers do different things. All of a sudden, they started taking advantage of the fact that people were working remotely, and people were on home networks, and people were trying to, the attackers were trying to seed people's corporate devices that were now outside the firewall with malware and with infrastructure, so that potentially down the road, when they went back into their firewall, they would be able to exploit that. These are the things that, the attackers are changing and are taking advantage of situations as they evolve. And the security teams need to adjust and have, as agile posture as the attackers, as they, defend corporate infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And just thinking about what you're talking about, and thinking about sort of the broad theme of the presentation, and to which I want to remind folks, again, if you do have a question, we do have some time left before the end of the presentation. So definitely go ahead and feel free to send us your question, again, or your comment, talking about your own experience with these. We've talked so much about some of the challenges that institutions are dealing with. And I think that, of course, on the other side of challenges are these opportunities. And a lot of what you're talking about now with the idea of flexibility, with the agility, the adaptability and change of responses. And while in some respects that might seem like there's less security, it almost shines to me the difference between having a wall of security and having a phalanx as your security, that both are very penetrable. Arguably, a wall is more secure than a phalanx, but the phalanx is adaptable. The phalanx can move, can adjust to the threat in a way that the wall can't. And it really seems like one of the, maybe it's a benefit, maybe not an opportunity, depending on how you want to word it, but one of the benefits out of this may become a much more agile sense of dealing with security threats, as opposed to maybe a pure fortress sense of just, we're just going to be so tough we can't be breached, as opposed to understanding there might be different vectors of threats and being able to move and respond to those threats while keeping productivity ongoing.
True. I think that the mindset of has been for quite some time. It's probably not about if you're going to get breached. It's about when you're going to get breached, and how do you adapt, and how do you contain, and how do you what mitigating measures do you have in place? Mm-hmm. And companies have taken different approaches over the years. in terms of once upon a time, the perimeter was the stronghold or the fortress that we have. We've gone now to perimeterless environments. We've gone to data-centric security approaches to protecting the data, to zero trust approaches in which we no longer give, carte blanche access to every resource on the network once we've granted access, to the network. So we definitely are building more and more, call them perimeterless approaches. I think that this was just this just propelled us 5 or 10 years ahead in terms of our ability to adjust to a new scenario in which so much of our workforce is remote, and we need to keep them productive with the IT systems in place, but also secure those new measures that we've put in place, but also secure some of the threats that were introduced as a result of this new footprint of employees working from anywhere. And I think that there's consensus that to some extent this flexibility or this adaptability of people working remotely is going to be part of our design patterns when we build our security and our IT practices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to ask a couple more questions, and I wanted to sort of follow up on this idea. That you said something earlier about the idea that some of these companies were on the phone with regulators just constantly. And you can imagine that the conversations between IT, security, the boards, and so forth, just going up to 11, as they say, during the stretch. And I'm wondering, what are some of the other benefits of this level of conversation going forward for companies, that they are finding themselves having longer and more intense conversations with either departments, with agencies, that they typically would not have had? Do you think there are other benefits to this that maybe we're not as aware of now, but are probably likely to play out for us, for these companies in the future?
I do. I think that, as I said earlier, I think that this has condensed a learning curve of 5 or 10 years into a 1 year period. And this spans across, the whole scope of digital transformation. You get companies that were those that were on the forefront, and those that were cloud first, and those that had the ability in place to already enable this flexibility and work from everywhere and do things in a more electronic fashion, weathered the storm a lot more successfully than those that were behind. But those that were behind realized that they needed to adjust very, 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 very quickly. And as I said earlier, I think the regulators also realized that some of the restrictions that were in place were had to be changed to facilitate some of this change. As it relates to agencies, I think that we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months significant increases in the nation state activities, whether it's the SolarWinds type of situations, which relates specifically to the supply chain question of, it's your IT and your security is not just about your employees. It's about your contractors. It's about your entire supply chain. It's about your partners. You have to give them access into your systems today. How do you secure all those types of, pieces in the IT or into the value chain? And that's gotten a lot of people, rethinking the strategies. And I think understanding some of the concerns or the challenges that we do have ahead of us. There's new regulation. There's a new directive in the US that's just come out that focuses around cybersecurity and some of the things that that companies need to do. So it's, as I said, I think that the pandemic has also gotten the attackers to adjust quickly. When there's chaos, it's an opportunity to do or to execute some of the plans that you've been building infrastructure for many years. There's a natural diversion taking place. Typically, when you try and infiltrate or try and attack a certain target, often it's accompanied with a diversion. Often a distributed denial attack is a precursor to another breach that's happening, because everyone looks to the left because there's a DDoS attack, and the breach happens somewhere else. Here, we didn't have to do a distributed denial of service. We had a natural event, a pandemic, that threw so much chaos into the IT and security organizations, that being able to now take advantage of some of the backdoors that were in place already and some of the infrastructure that the attackers had already in place meant, that was the right time for them to try and exfiltrate, or to try and expedite some of their plans to make the most of those capabilities that they had put in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We're coming up toward the end of our time, but I wanted to talk about one thing, maybe as a way of both sort of wrapping up and maybe key takeaways, I guess, for folks who've been attending the presentation, and that really does sort of have to do with this security freedom paradox, which I still think is really at the root of everything, and some of the things you just talked about. I'm curious in terms of some of the strategies that customers, and especially customers that you work with, that you know, have used to be able to sort of negotiate that balance between freedom, IT freedom, as you called it, and security. Sure,
I'm happy to talk about that. Obviously, the fundamental value proposition that we help customers with is essentially how do you resolve this paradox of, on the one hand, enabling more freedom, and on the other hand, not compromising or potentially even imposing more security restrictions. And the way we do that essentially is by splitting your device into two environments. So this is what Hysolate essentially is all about. So we let you essentially take that same operating system and create another operating system that's running in parallel to this operating system, but it's totally isolated. And what companies are doing essentially with this technology is eating their cake and having it too, to some extent, in a sense that they can now optimize two different worlds in a very customizable way. They can have one world, the typical everyday world that their employees need to do their corporate stuff, but they can have this other world on that same device in which they can give them either more freedom. So that's the environment they'll have them do their Zoom sessions and their Slack sessions and their free web browsing and downloading certain attachments. And if they need to use a thumb drive, that's the environment in which the thumb drive will connect into. And it's completely isolated from their typical corporate environment. So even if a threat is introduced into that environment, it's not affecting their corporate posture. This additional purple environment that's been deployed can be wiped instantly or reverted back to initial snapshot. So that really helps you eat that cake and use it and have it too. And on the other side, you can also use that purple world to do higher risk activities. So for example, if you have certain employees that need access to privileged systems, these could be employees in a bank that are doing SWIFT transfers. They need to connect to a separate SWIFT network from a different environment. That's what that additional half of their device now can do, and that's the only thing they can do. So they can't browse the web in that environment. They can't download it. That's their super hardened environment in which they do their super sensitive types of activities. It's almost a sterile environment from that perspective. And the third thing that customers are doing to address that challenge of contractors or BYODs is the ability to deploy Hysolate on that endpoint, even if that endpoint is not a corporate device. And by doing that, I can now, on your personal device or on a contractor's device, create an environment where I can control that environment, because this comes with a cloud management capability in which you can control every aspect of the permissions within that virtual environment that's deployed and running on that user's device. I can now use their device as a surrogate with an encapsulated environment that can connect only into my corporate environment. The user cannot exfiltrate any data from it. It's essentially you creating a stronghold or a foothold on their device in which they can now interact safely with our corporate or with their corporate environment. Those really are the ways that some of our customers are addressing this paradox.
Yeah, very, very interesting. How, in terms of integration, getting up and running with the technology, how much is involved in that?
So it's actually very simple. The installation or the creation of this additional environment on your endpoint is done through a super lightweight agent. Typically takes about 2 minutes to install. The user can install it by themselves. So if they're a contractor and it's not a corporate device, they'll get a link to download it, they'll install it. If this is a corporate device, it can be pushed out to their device through some of the software management technologies that companies use, like an Intune or an SCCM, so that the agents push to the endpoint. Once the agent's on the endpoint, it spins up this virtual environment, but every single aspect of that environment is controlled by a policy, and that policy is essentially downloaded from a cloud in a fraction of a second, and that determines what applications are installed inside, where you can connect to from that environment, what permissions that users have, essentially creating this additional desktop or this additional environment on that endpoint, but it's completely governed. The organization doesn't need to install any back-end infrastructure or any cloud infrastructure. The entire management of this is done from our SaaS multi-tenant solution. It integrates with single sign-on, with identity providers, so that within a large organization, all the users on the system that are using the system would be automatically pre-provisioned because of the fact that we can connect into their, whether it's their Okta or their Azure AD, and therefore all the identities are managed within the corporation and not within the Hysolate system. It's really, David, as simple as that.
Oh, very, very interesting, especially in the way that having gone through some of the different issues that you did in terms of some of the different technologies that are being used currently and some of the different technologies that people are looking to use, you see how Hysolate responds. We had that list of 4 or 5 different categories, and you see how in different ways this solution responds to each of those different sorts of issues, whether it's browser, whether it's what's happening at the endpoint, some of those different issues. And I think it's sort of interesting to see that all negotiated in a singular solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I said earlier, our goal is really to let companies eat the cake and have it too, and give the employees the freedom that they need in order to do their job, but also make sure that their corporate infrastructure is sound and secure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Very interesting. So in terms of wrapping up, sort of taking us to the end of the presentation, I'm wondering if there are just any top-level takeaways with regard to both the solution that's offered to handle some of these problems and just sort of the general sense of, again, this sort of challenge that the institutions are having, trying, again, to negotiate this balance between security and, if we call it freedom, if we call it productivity, if we just call it the normal activities of a human being in a connected world. I'm wondering if maybe there was a thought or two that you maybe want to leave with our attendees.
Sure. I mean, if I had to summarize the key takeaways that we've learned from the data that we've collected in these surveys and us engaging with our prospects and customers and different industry experts is, first of all, the concept or the notion of employee IT freedom or productivity is definitely way higher today than it was a year ago. And it's because of the fact that, the environment's different, so we're working remotely and the requirements that we have are different, and the tools that we need to use in order to address that present different types of challenges and threats. And therefore, the productivity is definitely top of mind. And I would say that the second thing that is important is the flexibility that IT organizations need to maintain to address any type of situation that might present itself, down the road. And this means potentially creating areas or facilities on users' device to do their high-risk activities, additional environments on their endpoint to do their low-risk activities, and also to address the challenge of non-corporate devices and how they essentially can securely interact with our organizations. All those have become even more acute today, and organizations are looking for solutions to those problems.
Excellent, excellent. And it's fantastic to know that in Hysolate there is such a solution. And folks should definitely get to know a little bit more about some of the opportunities that they've got to fix and respond to a number of these problems. Very, very interesting stuff. I do want to say that we're coming to the end of our presentations, but all the time we have for today. I want to thank you all for joining us for a very interesting conversation about something that, again, all of us are dealing with to one degree or the other with the new normal of working remotely, working from home, particularly those of us who are in financial services. So I want to thank Marc for his presentation. I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to let everyone know that you will be able to get a copy of the presentation. It will be available on the Finovate blog in the days to come. If there's things that you'd like to take back up, there's quite a bit of information in the study itself that you might want to take another look at. And I guess also, is it possible for folks with questions to reach out to you, Marc, as well?
Absolutely. You can, feel free to reach out to me. I will actually bring up my email right there. So if you do want to reach out to me directly, feel free to do so. I'd be happy to continue the conversation with anyone that's on the webinar.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you again, Marc, for a very interesting presentation again about something that is really defining the way that all of us are living and working right now. And again, thank you for joining us here for the Finovate FinTech Halftime Review. Have a fantastic day and a great week.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everyone.